They called him the Black Panther, not for how he fought, but for how he moved. Elegant, silent, deadly. While others chased size, Serge Nubret chased perfection. With training sessions that lasted for hours and a diet that bordered on myth, he didn't follow the rules. He rewrote them. And in 1975, he brought a version of himself to the Mr. Olympia that had Arnold worried. A version some say was unbeatable. But what happens when politics outweigh performance? What happens when a man refuses to bow to the system? What happens when, perhaps the greatest physique of the 1970s is erased from the spotlight just weeks before his moment of glory? This isn't just the story of a bodybuilder. This is the story of rebellion, of exile, of the forgotten king. This is the story of Serge Nubret. The island of Guadalupe was far from the bodybuilding capitals of the world. No gyms, no protein shakes, just dirt roads, sugarcane fields, and the rhythm of a simple life. It was here that Serge Nubret was born on October 6, 1938, the fourth of six children in a disciplined but loving household. Even as a boy, Serge stood out, lean, athletic, and effortlessly symmetrical. He played barefoot football and climbed trees like a panther. Locals noticed. They saw something sculptural in his posture, an elegance he didn't earn in a gym but was simply born with. At 12, his family moved to mainland France. The pace quickened, the climate changed, and so did the expectations. But Serge adapted fast. He read, observed, and carried himself with quiet discipline. He wasn't chasing rebellion. He was building himself, silently. Then one day in Paris, at 19 years old, he walked into a local gym. It wasn't a decision, it was a discovery. The iron, the chalk, the intensity. It pulled him in. Most newcomers mimicked. Serge studied. Within weeks, his body responded fast. Too fast to ignore. He didn't train to impress. He trained to understand, to master. His movements were precise, almost graceful. And in those quiet corners of the gym, something was awakening. He wasn't trying to be the next Steve Reeves or Reg Park. He was forging something else, something never seen before. This wasn't just the birth of a bodybuilder. It was the beginning of an artist. If Serge Nubret was a sculptor, the tool he used to carve himself wasn't brute strength. It was volume. Endless, punishing volume. Serge Nubret once said, "Your physique lies to your mind, and if your mind is weak, you follow your physique. You say, okay, I've been here for 2 hours. I have to go home. Okay, since the mind is weak, you say, okay, let's go home. You're right. But if your mind is powerful, you say, no, we'll go. Keep going. Okay. And then you love what you're doing and you'll never be tired, because your physique will never be tired. Only the mind drives your physique, and the mind is never tired. It's powerful." Kamchinyan. While the bodybuilding world was obsessed with heavy weights and low reps, Serge was doing something entirely different. He didn't care about how much he could lift. He cared about how the muscle looked, how it felt, how it moved under the skin. In his eyes, the gym wasn't a battleground. It was an art studio. At the core of his training philosophy was one simple principle: the muscle grows from work, not from weight. One of Serge's favorite and most beneficial techniques was faster-paced training. With rest periods between sets averaging a mere 10 seconds, there was no need for additional aerobics. This method of training is one of the reasons Serge was able to stay in good shape year-round. By performing set after non-stop set, the muscles stayed pumped and were pushed into further states of exhaustion. Obviously, the word overtraining was not in Serge's vocabulary, as his physique was clearly not stringy or depleted. He believed that high-volume, high-rep training paired with short rest periods was the fastest way to create the kind of dense, aesthetic muscle that defined his physique. His workouts were long, often up to 3 hours per day, 6 days a week, but they weren't slow. In fact, they moved with an intensity that was deceptive. He didn't do deadlifts. He didn't squat heavy. And yet, his physique could stand next to the mass monsters of the 70s and still stand out. His signature style, massive amounts of sets, often 20 to 30 sets per muscle group, and each set falling in the 12 to 20 rep range. He focused on isolation, contraction, and feeling, not just lifting a weight from point A to B. Chest day, for example, could include 20 sets of flat bench press, followed by 15 sets of incline, and another 15 for flies. He didn't count reps as much as he chased the burn, and he believed in training until the muscle was full, engorged, and trembling. But Serge didn't just break convention with his training. His approach to nutrition was equally unorthodox, and some would say radical. He didn't believe in eating 6 or 7 small meals a day. He didn't carry Tupperware around. In fact, he only ate once per day. That one meal? Enormous. He followed a high-calorie, high-carbohydrate diet, often consuming over 6 pounds of red meat along with large portions of rice, beans, and lentils, all in one single sitting, typically in the evening. This way of eating allowed him to train fasted, which he believed helped with focus and intensity in the gym. His protein intake came largely from horse meat. No shakes, no bars, no supplements, just whole food, eaten like a feast, not a chore. It said Serge was into horse meat, and he thought it was the best protein in the world. Very low in fat, extremely high protein per volume, and he loved it. For Serge, food wasn't fuel in the mechanical sense. It was part of a rhythm. He trained hard, he earned his hunger, and he fed the body like a king once the day's work was done. He didn't count macros, he didn't log calories. His body was his measurement tool. If he felt flat, he ate more. If he felt sluggish, he adjusted. He trusted instinct over spreadsheets and feeling over formulas. Many dismissed his methods as outdated or even reckless, but it was hard to argue with the results. Serge Nubret maintained one of the most admired physiques in bodybuilding history, without ever adopting the modern, science-based mind. By the late 1960s, Serge wasn't just a dominant figure in bodybuilding. He was also a rising face on the big screen. At a time when few black men were being cast in heroic roles, Serge's chiseled physique and regal presence made him a natural fit for the Italian sword and sandal films sweeping Europe. He starred as a Mesopotamian king in The Titans in 1963, flexed alongside gladiators in The Terror of Rome, and even took small roles in mainstream French films. His on-screen charisma gave him something most bodybuilders lacked: crossover appeal. Before Pumping Iron rolled its cameras, Serge had already become a leading man overseas, admired not just for his physique, but for his commanding presence. Serge Nubret was already a force in bodybuilding. In 1958, just a year into training, he won World's Most Muscular Man at only 20 years old. The early 60s were quiet, but by 1964 he took Mr. Europe. A year later, he claimed Mr. World. Serge wasn't just rising, he was redefining what a champion could look like: symmetry, shape, and finesse over brute mass. In 1970, he stood toe-to-toe with Arnold Schwarzenegger at the NABA Mr. Universe, placing second in a controversial decision. By 1972, he stepped onto bodybuilding's biggest stage, placing third at Mr. Olympia behind Arnold and Sergio Oliva. He repeated that feat in 1973, proving he belonged in the upper echelon. With iconic aesthetics, a razor-sharp vacuum pose, and cover model looks, Serge became one of the most photographed physiques in the world. By the time Pumping Iron came around in 1975, Serge had already done it all. In 1975, Serge Nubret was at the height of his powers. His physique was sharper than ever: round muscle bellies, tight waist, razor-sharp abs, a body that looked like it was sketched straight out of a comic book. And this time, he wasn't just another elite competitor. He was the man many believed could dethrone Arnold Schwarzenegger. But while his muscles were ready, the politics behind the scenes were not. The venue for that year's Mr. Olympia had already raised eyebrows: South Africa, a country under international scrutiny for its apartheid policies. Serge, as the first vice president of the IFBB, had played a major role in advocating for the competition to be hosted there, believing that sport could rise above politics. But that very decision would later be used against him. 12 days before the competition, Serge was told he wouldn't be allowed to compete. The reason? An accusation that he had appeared in a pornographic film, a claim without evidence, and one he vehemently denied. Ironically, in a sport filled with double standards, other competitors, with far more controversial histories, remained untouched. Serge was devastated. He stopped training. He stopped eating. The psychological blow shattered months of focused preparation. For nearly 2 weeks, his body wasted away, losing 12 pounds, losing the fullness, losing the sharpness that could have changed the outcome of Olympia history. Serge said, "You know, when you have been training for 3 months for the contest and you come to the country, they tell you you cannot compete. I stopped eating. I stopped training. I could not eat for 12 days. In South Africa, Arnold was far from his peak. Having slimmed down for his role in Stay Hungry, he was 220 pounds, off his usual mark. The version of Serge that had arrived 12 days prior, that man might have beaten Arnold. But the Serge that finally stepped on stage had been depleted, mentally, physically, emotionally. Despite this, he still managed to place second in the heavyweight class, above Lou Ferrigno, but just behind Arnold. It was one of the biggest what-ifs in bodybuilding history. What if Serge had competed at full strength? The truth is, Serge had become a threat not just to Arnold's title, but to the entire Weider system. He was intelligent, articulate, respected internationally. He held power. He challenged decisions. He didn't bow to authority. And he wasn't American. Serge never signed a Weider contract. He refused to move to California. He didn't promote supplements, and he didn't parrot the Weider principles. In an era of centralized bodybuilding control, that made him dangerous. That's why Pumping Iron treated him the way it did. Despite being filmed training in France, Serge was barely featured in the final cut of the movie. Why? Because he refused the offer of $200 for his image rights, an insult Serge declined. In return, he was edited down to a footnote, just another competitor to be beaten by Arnold, not the genuine threat he really was. Arnold and Franco used pumping iron to catapult themselves into the mainstream. Serge was pushed into the shadows. After 1975, Serge Nubret was suspended from the IFBB. He never competed at Mr. Olympia again, and in doing so, the sport lost one of its greatest uncrowned champions. Serge was a rebel, a thinker, a man who played by his own rules. But the cost of that independence was exile. The history books may not list him with the 8-time winners and American legends, but among the purists, those who know the game, Serge Nubret will always be remembered as the man who should have changed bodybuilding history. After the events of the 1975 Mr. Olympia, Serge Nubret didn't simply fade into the shadows. He might have been pushed out of the IFBB's inner circle, but Serge carved out his own lane. He stayed in Europe, continued to act in films, competed in other federations like WABA, and refused to conform to the expectations of the bodybuilding establishment. In his mind, he wasn't just a competitor, he was a visionary. While others flocked to California and cozied up to the Weider empire, Serge remained defiantly independent. He was blacklisted from Olympia competition at the peak of his career, a period when he, Sergio Oliva, and a few others could have realistically dominated the stage. But Serge didn't bend. He declined the Weider's contract, refused to adopt their training methods, and rejected their commercial supplement lines. He wasn't in bodybuilding to sell protein powder. And that defiance came at a cost. As the years went on, Serge's name started to fade from the mainstream narrative. He was rarely featured in major bodybuilding publications. His contributions were minimized. The Pumping Iron documentary, which could have cemented his legacy to the masses, edited him down to a footnote. In a story that centered Arnold Franco and Lou Ferrigno, Serge, arguably one of the best physiques of that era, was conveniently left in the background. Still, Serge wasn't finished. He continued competing into the 1980s, particularly in the WABA Federation, routinely showing up with incredible conditioning well into his 50s. In 1981, just weeks before the WABA World Cup, Serge was reportedly 44 pounds overweight and completely out of shape. But within 10 weeks, he turned it around, gaining 20 pounds of muscle and showing up shredded. He took second to Sergio Oliva, but it was clear, even in his later years, Serge Nubret was still capable of near-mythical transformation. It was around this time that whispers began circulating, not just about his physique, but about what was really going on behind it. And years later, when Serge began posting online and joining bodybuilding forums to speak directly with fans, the controversies only deepened. Many were drawn to his mystique, his old-school mindset, his aesthetic standards, but others couldn't help but question the consistency of his claims. In particular, Serge often insisted he was a natural bodybuilder, both in interviews and online. Serge Nubret said, "You have to push your body, so the nature or God have that in your body, and you have the natural steroid and the best, because a copycat is never better than the original." To many, especially those who had witnessed his stage-ready form in the 70s and 80s, this felt like a stretch. His muscle fullness, paper-thin conditioning, and repeated late-career comebacks seemed superhuman, even by today's standards. And while Serge often spoke in abstract, philosophical tones, likening bodybuilding to an art form, some of his public statements ignited heated debates in forums. On one hand, you had a generation of lifters who viewed Serge as a god, a timeless aesthetic icon. On the other, skeptics who accused him of misleading young athletes by denying the obvious role of performance-enhancing drugs. What complicated the discussion further was the actual evidence. Conversations with his peers revealed that Serge, like most of the top athletes of his time, had used anabolic substances. Parabolin, a form of trenbolone, produced by the French pharmaceutical company Negma, was reportedly his compound of choice in the 70s. Later, he was said to have used primobolan and a testosterone-nandrolone blend called trofabolin to manage water retention and maintain hardness. For fat loss, he allegedly used thyroid agents like Triacana cream and even metabolic stimulants. A reporter said, "Later on, Serge told me that he was on speed non-stop. More than steroids, he used two major steroids, preabalone, injectable in 100 milligrams and a local steroid made in France called trofaboline. He also took Primabol and orals. Serge used two special creams that he would mix together to reduce subcutaneous fat, the yomucase and triacana cream. Still, Serge never openly admitted this. Whether it was a desire to protect his legacy, a philosophical belief that downplayed the role of drugs, or simply a refusal to give the system more ammunition against him, it remains unclear. But the result was the same: debate. Forums lit up with threads dissecting his claims, questioning his honesty, and arguing over what kind of example he was setting for the next generation. Through it all, Serge remained somewhat enigmatic. He continued sharing stories, reflections, and philosophical takes on training and life. He saw bodybuilding as a vehicle for self-expression, not merely a contest of mass or drugs. And in that sense, he stood apart from almost everyone else. He represented an era that for many symbolized purity and aesthetics, even if the behind-the-scenes realities were far more complicated. So by the late 2000s, Serge Nubret had become something of a cult figure, revered by a select group, debated by many, but understood by few. His refusal to play the game cost him titles, endorsements, and widespread recognition. But in doing so, he became the embodiment of rebellion in a sport that often punishes anyone who doesn't fall in line. For Serge, that was a price worth paying. On March 19, 2009, Serge was found unconscious in his home. He had slipped into a coma under suspicious circumstances. Official reports were inconclusive. Some believed it was a stroke. Others whispered darker theories: poisoning, foul play, especially given Serge's combative relationship with the IFBB and his refusal to fall in line. Regardless of the cause, Serge never fully recovered. He spent the final 2 years of his life in a long-term care facility, unable to speak until his death in April 2011 at the age of 72. The silence that had once been a part of Serge's mystique now became final.
But Serge Nubret's story didn't end there. In fact, his legend only grew stronger in death. Unlike most bodybuilders of his era, Serge's legacy wasn't defined by a shelf full of Sando trophies. It was carved into the aesthetic ideal itself. He represented the golden age of proportion, symmetry, and shape. His wide shoulders, impossibly small waist, razor-sharp abs, and dense yet elegant muscle bellies became the blueprint for what many would call the perfect physique. And no one understood that more than the next generation. Long after his last competition, Serge's photos continued to circulate online, where a new breed of aspiring lifters stumbled across his physique and instantly became obsessed. One of the most notable was a young Australian by the name of Aziz Shavershian, better known to the internet as Ziz. Ziz, like many others, discovered Serge through old YouTube videos and bodybuilding forums. To him, Serge wasn't just a bodybuilder. He was a symbol of aesthetic rebellion. Ziz modeled his own transformation off the Nubret ideal. In countless forum posts and interviews, Ziz referred to Serge as the ultimate aesthetic, calling him a god and frequently citing his influence when discussing his own goals. It was a full-circle moment. The man who had once been cast aside by the establishment had become the spiritual father of the online aesthetics movement. The Ziz generation didn't care about placings or politics. They worshipped form, and Serge embodied it. Even beyond Ziz, countless fitness influencers, natural bodybuilders, and online personalities still point to Serge Nubret as their North Star. His training philosophies, his high-volume, pump-based routines, his stoic approach to discipline and diet, all of it continues to shape the mindset of modern-day fitness culture. In many ways, Serge was decades ahead of his time. He rejected bulk-for-size mentalities. He preached muscle control, mind-body connection, and training with intention. While others chased numbers, Serge sculpted. And now, long after his passing, the world seems to be catching up. He died with no Olympia titles, no supplement line, no multi-million-dollar brand to his name. But what Serge Nubret left behind can't be measured in medals. He left behind an ideal, one that still haunts stages, screens, and gyms to this day. Sazmadeka Kog, bodybuilding is not a sport, it's an art, and I am the artist. That may explain why his influence endures. Not because of what he won, but because of what he represented: perfection, rebellion, and the reminder that sometimes the greatest legends are the ones who refuse to play by the rules.